When widowed rancher James Caldwell hired Catherine Riley as his cook in 1867 Montana Territory, he never expected her gentle care for his heartbroken 6-year-old daughter Lucy would crack the walls around his own shattered heart. But when Lucy's uncle arrives threatening to take her away to Boston, claiming their unconventional household is improper, James faces an impossible choice between protecting his sworn vow to never love again and fighting for the family he never knew he wanted. Will a man who buried his heart with his wife risk everything to save the woman and child who brought it back to life? A child's scream cut through the Montana morning like a knife through butter. James Caldwell dropped his coffee cup, the hot liquid splashing across the wooden porch as he rushed toward the sound. Inside the ranch house, 6-year-old Lucy stood in the middle of the kitchen, her nightgown covered in flour, tears streaming down her face like tiny rivers. "The biscuits are black," she wailed, pointing at the smoking pan on the stove. "I tried to make them like Mama used to, but they're all wrong." James felt his heart crack a little more. 3 years had passed since Margaret died from the fever, but mornings like this made it feel like yesterday. He knelt beside his daughter, brushing flour from her tangled blonde hair. The kitchen looked like a tornado had swept through it, broken eggs on the floor, milk spilled across the counter, and that awful smell of burnt bread filling the air. "It's okay, little star," he whispered, using the pet name Margaret had given her. "We'll figure something out." But deep down, James knew they were drowning. The fourth cook had quit just yesterday, claiming Lucy was too difficult and the house too sad. How could he explain that his daughter wasn't difficult? She was just lost, trying to fill a hole that could never be filled. Lucy wiped her nose on her sleeve, leaving a streak of flour. "Mrs. Henderson said I should go live with Uncle Charles in Boston. She said little girls need proper ladies to teach them things." James's jaw tightened. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, had been dropping hints for months about Lucy's wild ways and his unsuitable household. The whole town of Clearwater seemed to have opinions about how he should raise his daughter. "What do you think about that?" James asked carefully. Lucy's lower lip trembled. "I don't want to leave you, Papa, and I don't want to leave Mama's garden." Through the window, James could see the rose bushes Margaret had planted, now brown and thorny in the October cold. Everything she had touched was dying, including their daughter's spirit. "We're not giving up," he said firmly, though he wasn't sure how to keep that promise. "We'll find someone who understands." Understands what? That sometimes broken things just need the right person to help put them back together. Lucy nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense. At 6 years old, she had already learned too much about broken things. James stood and looked around the destroyed kitchen. Somewhere out there was a person who could help them. Someone who wouldn't run away when Lucy had nightmares, or when she talked to her mother's picture. Someone who might see past the sadness to the love that still lived in this house. He had to find that person soon, before his daughter forgot how to smile completely. The morning sun streamed through the dusty windows, highlighting the mess they had made. James picked up a wooden spoon from the floor and handed it to Lucy like a magic wand. "Want to help me clean up this disaster?" he asked. For the first time that morning, Lucy almost smiled. "Can we pretend we're explorers cleaning up after a great adventure?" "The greatest adventure," James agreed, even though his heart wasn't in the game. As they worked together, sweeping flour and wiping surfaces, James tried not to think about the growing stack of bills on his desk or the worried looks from the neighbors. He tried not to wonder if he was failing the one person who mattered most. But when Lucy hummed one of Margaret's old lullabies while scrubbing the table, James felt a tiny spark of hope. Maybe they could survive this. Maybe someone would come along who could help them find their way back to being a family again. He just had to keep believing in maybes, even when everything else felt impossible. The clock on the mantel chimed 8 times, reminding James that the ranch work couldn't wait for broken hearts to heal. Cattle needed feeding, fences needed mending, and life kept moving forward whether they were ready or not. "Lucy," he said, hanging up the dish rag, "how about we ride out to check the horses after breakfast?" Her eyes lit up, the first real spark he'd seen in days. "Can I ride Buttercup by myself?" "We'll see." James ruffled her flour-dusted hair. "First, Let's see if we can manage some eggs without burning down the house. Lucy giggled, and the sound was like music after a long silence. 3 days later, James stood in Murphy's general store, his hat in his hands and his pride somewhere around his boots. The elderly shopkeeper, Patrick Murphy, had known Margaret since she was Lucy's age, and his kind eyes held more sympathy than judgment. "You're looking for help again," Murphy said gently, not making it a question. "The widow Harrison's girl left yesterday," James admitted. "Said Lucy asked too many questions about her mother." Murphy shook his head sadly. "That child's just trying to keep her mama's memory alive. Nothing wrong with questions. Tell that to every woman in 3 counties. James leaned against the counter, exhaustion weighing on his shoulders like a heavy coat. "I'm running out of options, Patrick." The bell above the door chimed, and both men looked up to see a woman enter. She was small and neat, with dark brown hair pinned simply and a traveling dress that had seen better days but was carefully mended. Her eyes were the color of summer grass, and they held a quiet strength that made James straighten up. "Excuse me," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I'm looking for information about work. Someone in town mentioned there might be a position available." Murphy glanced at James, his eyebrows raised hopefully. "This here is James Caldwell. He owns the big ranch outside town." The woman turned to James, studying his face with the same careful attention he was giving her. "I'm Catherine Riley. I heard you might need a cook." James felt his heart skip, but he forced himself to be honest. "Miss Riley, I should warn you. This isn't an easy position. My daughter, she's been through a lot. The last few women couldn't handle." "Handle what?" Catherine asked, and there was something in her tone that wasn't afraid. "Questions. Sadness. A 6-year-old who misses her mother so much she sometimes cries in her sleep." The words came out rougher than James intended. Catherine was quiet for a moment, and James prepared himself for another polite refusal. Instead, she said, "I lost my own mother when I was 7. I remember the questions." Something in James's chest loosened slightly. "Where are you from, Miss Riley?" "Most recently, Denver. Before that, St. Louis." She paused, and James sensed there was more to her story. "I'm good with children, Mr. Caldwell, and I understand that sometimes a house needs more than just cooking." Murphy cleared his throat. "Catherine here just got off the stage. Been asking around about work since she arrived." James studied this woman who had appeared like an answer to a prayer he hadn't dared pray. There was something different about her, a steadiness that the others had lacked. "Would you like to meet Lucy?" he heard himself asking. "Before you decide?" Catherine nodded. "I'd like that very much." The ride to the ranch was quiet, with Catherine sitting beside James on the wagon seat, her small bag at her feet. She didn't chatter nervously like the other women had, but she wasn't unfriendly either. She seemed to be listening to something. The sound of the horses' hooves, the wind in the grass, the story the land was telling. "It's beautiful here," she said finally, as they topped the hill that showed the ranch spread out below. "My wife loved this view," James found himself saying. "She used to sit on the porch in the evenings and watch the sunset." "What was she like?" The question was gentle, not prying. James considered how to answer. "Margaret was light. She made everything better just by being there. Lucy has her smile. That's a wonderful gift to pass on." They pulled up to the house just as Lucy came running from the barn, her dress dirty and her hair escaping from its braids. She stopped short when she saw the stranger, suddenly shy. "Lucy," James called, "come meet Miss Riley. She might be our new cook." Lucy approached slowly, her green eyes so like Margaret's, studying Catherine with the serious expression of a child who had learned to be careful with new people. "Hello, Lucy," Catherine said, not talking down to her but speaking as if they were equals. "Your father tells me you've been learning to cook." Lucy's cheeks turned pink. "I'm not very good at it. I burned the biscuits." "Biscuits can be tricky," Catherine agreed solemnly. "The secret is watching them like a hawk and never trusting them completely." "Really? Really? Biscuits are sneaky that way." And then, miracle of miracles, Lucy giggled. The sound made James's heart leap with hope he'd been afraid to feel. Catherine knelt down to Lucy's level. "Would you like to show me the kitchen? I'd love to see where you've been practicing your cooking." As they walked toward the house together, Lucy chattering about the chickens and the garden and her horse Buttercup, James felt something he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Maybe this time would be different. The smell of burning bacon jolted James awake 3 weeks later, but instead of panic, he found himself smiling. Catherine's laughter drifted up from the kitchen, mixed with Lucy's excited chatter about something going wrong but not being the end of the world. "Miss Catherine, the bacon is dancing." Lucy's voice carried pure joy. "Well then, we'd better give it some music," Catherine replied, and James heard the sound of wooden spoons tapping against pots like drums. He dressed quickly, amazed at how different mornings felt now. The house hummed with life again. Not the same melody it had played when Margaret was alive, but a new song that was somehow just as sweet. Downstairs, he found Catherine at the stove, her hair slightly messed from sleep, directing Lucy in the fine art of flipping pancakes. Lucy stood on a wooden stool, tongue poking out in concentration as she wielded the spatula like a sword. "Good morning, Papa," Lucy beamed, not taking her eyes off the pan. "I'm making breakfast all by myself." "With excellent supervision," James noted, catching Catherine's eye. She blushed slightly, as if embarrassed to be caught in her nighttime cooking clothes, a simple dress and apron that made her look younger somehow. "The bacon started smoking," Catherine explained, pointing to the pan she'd moved off the heat. Lucy decided it was trying to send signals to the cavalry. "Important signals," Lucy added seriously. "About pancakes." James poured himself coffee from the pot Catherine always kept ready, marveling at how natural this felt. For 3 years, mornings had been battles to survive. Now they were adventures to enjoy. "Mr. Caldwell," Catherine said, suddenly formal again, "I wanted to ask about taking Lucy to town today. Mrs. Murphy mentioned the school might be starting a reading circle for younger children." James nearly choked on his coffee. "School? Lucy's never been to proper school." "I know," Catherine said carefully, "but she's so bright, and she asks such wonderful questions. I thought she might enjoy being around other children." Lucy's pancake flipped perfectly, but her excitement dimmed. "Do I have to go, Papa? What if the other children don't like me?" The question hit James like a punch. Margaret had taught Lucy her letters and numbers, but since the fever, James had been too overwhelmed to think about formal education. The idea of his daughter facing judgment from other children made his protective instincts roar. "You don't have to do anything you don't want to," he said firmly. "But," Catherine interjected gently, "sometimes the things that scare us most are the ones worth trying." She moved to stand beside Lucy, both of them focused on the next pancake. "When I was your age, I was terrified of other children. They seemed to know secrets I didn't understand." "What did you do?" Lucy asked. "I hid for a long time, but then I realized I was missing out on making friends who might like the same books I did." James watched this exchange with growing unease. Catherine was pushing Lucy toward things that might hurt her. What if the town children were cruel? What if they whispered about Lucy's wild hair and strange questions? "The reading circle is just once a week," Catherine continued. "We could visit today and see how it feels." "I want to try," Lucy announced suddenly, surprising them both. "But only if Miss Catherine comes with me." "Of course," Catherine smiled. "We're a team." Something cold settled in James's stomach. Catherine and Lucy were becoming a team, but where did that leave him? He was the father, the protector, the one who should make these decisions. "I'll drive you both," he said, more sharply than intended. Catherine looked at him with those perceptive green eyes. "Is that all right with you, Mr. Caldwell? I don't want to overstep." The careful politeness stung worse than anger would have. James realized he was jealous of how easily Catherine connected with Lucy, jealous of decisions being made without him, jealous of the happiness that seemed to flow so naturally between them. "It's fine," he lied. But as he watched Lucy and Catherine work together, chattering about books and adventures, James wondered if hiring Catherine had been the biggest mistake of his life. Not because she was failing, but because she was succeeding so completely that his own role as Lucy's father was disappearing. The kitchen filled with the scent of perfect pancakes and fresh coffee, but James had lost his appetite. How could he compete with someone who made everything look so easy? "Papa," Lucy said, offering him the first pancake with a proud smile. "Try it. Miss Catherine taught me the secret." James took a bite, and it was delicious, light and fluffy, and made with love. But all he could taste was the fear that his daughter was slipping away from him, one perfect pancake at a time. "It's wonderful, little star," he managed. "Miss Catherine says cooking is like magic," Lucy bubbled. "You put in ordinary things, but if you do it with the right heart, something special comes out." James glanced at Catherine, who was quietly cleaning up the mess, giving Lucy all the credit for their shared success. Her selflessness only made his jealousy burn brighter. What happened when Lucy decided Catherine was a better parent than he was? What happened when the whole town saw how much happier his daughter was with another woman? What happened when Catherine realized she could do better than a broken widower and his damaged child? "We should get ready for town," he said abruptly, standing so fast his chair scraped against the floor. Lucy's face fell. "Did I do something wrong?" "No, sweetheart," Catherine said quickly, shooting James a confused look. "Your father's just eager to show off your pancake skills to Mrs. Murphy." The lie came so smoothly that James realized Catherine was already protecting Lucy from his moods. Another reminder that she was better at this than he was. As they prepared for the trip to town, James tried to shake off his dark thoughts. Catherine was helping his daughter bloom. Wasn't that what he had prayed for? So why did every success feel like his own failure? Maybe because he was terrified that once Lucy found her wings, she would fly away from him completely. The morning sun streamed through the windows, highlighting the easy domesticity between Catherine and Lucy as they packed a small bag for their adventure. James felt like an outsider looking in on the family he had always wanted but somehow couldn't quite reach. "Ready, Papa?" Lucy asked, taking his hand with complete trust. "Ready," James said, though he had never felt less prepared for anything in his life. As they walked toward the wagon, James caught Catherine watching him with concern. She opened her mouth as if to say something, then closed it again. The questions hanging between them felt heavier than the Montana sky. Thunder cracked like a whip across the afternoon sky, sending the horses dancing sideways as James fought to control the wagon. Rain began falling in fat drops that splattered against the dusty road, turning it to mud within minutes. "Get under the tarp," James shouted to Catherine and Lucy, who were huddled together on the wagon seat beside him. But Lucy was staring at something ahead on the road, a figure stumbling through the storm, bent against the wind. As they got closer, James recognized old Pete Hawkins, the prospector who lived alone in the hills. "Stop," Catherine called out. "He needs help." James pulled the horses to a halt, rain already soaking through his shirt. Pete stumbled toward them, his face pale and his left arm hanging at an odd angle. "Bear," Pete gasped. "Surprised her with cubs. Knocked me down good." Catherine was already climbing down from the wagon, ignoring the downpour. "Lucy, can you hold the horses steady while your father helps Mr. Hawkins?" "Yes, ma'am." Lucy took the reins with both hands, her small face serious with responsibility. James and Catherine helped Pete into the wagon bed, and Catherine immediately began examining his arm. Her movements were quick and sure, like she had done this before. "It's broken," she announced. "We need to get him to Doc Peterson right away." "Doc's in Helena for the week," James said grimly. "Won't be back until Tuesday. Then we'll have to manage ourselves." Catherine's voice was calm but determined. "Mr. Hawkins, this is going to hurt, but I need to set the bone before it heals wrong." Pete's eyes widened. "You know how to do that, miss? My father was a traveling doctor. I learned some things." Catherine looked at James. "Can you hold him steady?" The next few minutes were a blur of pain and determination. Catherine worked with steady hands while Pete gritted his teeth and James tried not to think about how much this petite woman knew about medicine. She bound the arm with strips torn from her own petticoat, fashioning a sling with the same efficiency she brought to everything else. There, she said finally, rain dripping from her hair. It should heal properly now, but you need to keep it still for at least 6 weeks. Miss Catherine, Lucy piped up from her perch on the wagon seat. You're like a real doctor. Catherine blushed. Just someone who pays attention to what she's taught. As they drove toward Pete's cabin, James found himself stealing glances at this woman who continued to surprise him. First, she had won Lucy's heart with kindness, then handled the school visit with perfect grace, and now she was setting bones like a trained physician. How did you really learn to do that? He asked quietly while Pete dozed and Lucy entertained herself by naming cloud shapes. Catherine was silent for so long that James thought she wouldn't answer. Finally, she said, My father wasn't just a traveling doctor. He was a drunk who lost his license in St. Louis. We moved around a lot, and I had to learn to take care of people when he couldn't. The admission hung between them like a bridge James wasn't sure he should cross. Is that why you came to Montana? Partly. Catherine's hands twisted in her lap. After he died, I tried to make a respectable life in Denver. But people talk, and soon everyone knew about the disgraced doctor's daughter, who thought she was too good for proper women's work. James felt pieces clicking together. So you ran. I prefer to think of it as starting over. Catherine's smile was sad but determined. Sometimes a person needs a place where nobody knows their story. But what if someone finds out? What if word gets back to Denver? The question seemed to hit Catherine like a physical blow. She looked down at her hands, and James realized he had touched on her deepest fear. Then I suppose I'll have to find another place to start over, she said quietly. Lucy's cheerful chatter from the front seat filled the silence that followed. She was pointing out a hawk circling overhead, completely unaware of the serious conversation happening behind her. James felt his protective instincts warring with something deeper. This woman who had brought such joy to his daughter was carrying secrets that could destroy everything if discovered. But as he watched her gentle hands check Pete's bandages, he realized he didn't care about her past. Catherine, he said softly, what happened in Denver doesn't matter here. She looked up, surprised by the use of her first name. It might matter to other people, not to the people who count. James held her gaze steadily. Lucy needs you. I need you. That's enough. For a moment, Catherine's careful composure cracked, and James saw the frightened young woman behind the competent facade. Then the wagon hit a rut, jolting them all, and the moment passed. We're almost to Mr. Hawkins's place, Lucy announced. Look, Papa. His chickens are all hiding from the rain. As they helped Pete into his tiny cabin and made sure he had everything he needed, James found himself watching Catherine work. She built up his fire, checked his food supplies, and left clear instructions for caring for his arm. Miss Riley, Pete said as they prepared to leave, I ain't got much, but you saved my arm, maybe my life. If there's ever anything you need, just take care of yourself, Mr. Hawkins, Catherine replied, and send word if the pain gets worse. On the ride home, with the storm clearing and Lucy dozing against Catherine's shoulder, James made a decision that surprised him. I'm going to teach you to shoot, he announced. Catherine blinked. I beg your pardon? If you're going to be out here, dealing with injured prospectors and who knows what else, you need to know how to protect yourself. James kept his eyes on the road. And Lucy should learn too when she's older. Mr. Caldwell, I don't think that's appropriate for a lady. Appropriate died with Margaret, James said more harshly than he intended. Out here, survival matters more than what's proper. Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then, all right, but only if you let me teach Lucy more about healing. A person should know how to help as well as defend. Deal. James offered his hand, and Catherine shook it solemnly. As the ranch came into view, golden in the evening light, James realized something had shifted between them. They were no longer employer and employee, but partners in keeping Lucy safe and happy. The thought should have frightened him, but instead, it felt like coming home. The gunshot echoed across the valley like a promise kept, and Lucy whooped with joy as the tin can flew off the fence post. Catherine lowered the rifle with shaking hands, hardly believing she had actually hit the target. Beginner's luck, she breathed. But James was grinning like she had just performed magic. That was incredible. Lucy bounced on her toes. Miss Catherine, you're a real cowgirl now. It had been 2 weeks since James started the shooting lessons, and Catherine was finally beginning to understand why he insisted on them. The Montana Territory was beautiful but wild, and a woman alone needed more than prayers for protection. Your turn, little star, James said, kneeling to help Lucy with the smaller rifle he had bought specially for her. Remember what we practiced about breathing. Catherine watched them work together, father and daughter moving with the easy partnership that came from shared purpose. These lessons had brought them closer somehow, creating a space where all three of them belonged. Papa, Lucy said, squinting down the barrel, why did you really want us to learn this? James was quiet for a moment, his hands steady on the rifle as he helped her aim. Because I can't always be there to protect you. And Miss Catherine has proven she's brave enough to handle whatever comes. The words sent warmth spreading through Catherine's chest. In Denver, people had whispered that she was too bold, too willing to step outside proper boundaries. Here, those same qualities were seen as strengths. Lucy fired, and her shot went wide, kicking up dust near the fence. I missed. You'll get it, James encouraged. These things take practice. How long did it take you to learn, Papa? My father started teaching me when I was about your age. Said a man needed to know how to feed his family and keep them safe. James's expression grew distant. Course, he never imagined I'd be teaching his granddaughter the same skills. Catherine sensed there was more to this story, but before she could ask, the sound of hoofbeats interrupted their lesson. A rider was approaching fast, kicking up a cloud of dust that made Catherine squint against the afternoon sun. That's Tom Bradley from the telegraph office, James said, lowering his rifle with a frown. He only rides out here for important messages. The young man pulled his horse to a stop near the fence, his face serious beneath his hat. Mr. Caldwell, got a telegram for you. Came in this morning from Boston. Catherine felt ice form in her stomach. Boston meant only one thing: Lucy's Uncle Charles, Margaret's brother who had been suspiciously quiet since Margaret's death. James tore open the yellow paper, his face growing darker with each word he read. Catherine watched his jaw clench, watched his knuckles turn white as his grip tightened on the message. What is it, Papa? Lucy asked, suddenly subdued by the tension crackling in the air. Uncle Charles is coming for a visit, James said carefully, but Catherine heard the anger underneath his controlled tone. Uncle Charles. Lucy brightened. I haven't seen him since Mama's funeral. Will he bring me presents from Boston? I'm sure he will, sweetheart. James folded the telegram, but not before Catherine caught a glimpse of words that made her blood run cold. Concerns about Lucy's upbringing and proper arrangements. Tom Bradley shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Mr. Caldwell, he asked me to tell you he'll be on next week's stage. Said something about bringing his wife this time. After Tom rode away, an uncomfortable silence settled over their little shooting lesson. Lucy had wandered off to chase a butterfly, leaving James and Catherine standing by the fence with the weight of unspoken worries between them. He's coming to take her away, James said finally, his voice flat and defeated. You don't know that, Catherine replied, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. I know Charles Hartwell. He's been looking for an excuse since Margaret died. James stared at the crumpled telegram. A single father, an unmarried woman in the house, a child running wild on a ranch instead of learning proper manners. It's everything he's been waiting for. Catherine felt the familiar urge to run, to pack her bag and disappear before anyone could point fingers or ask uncomfortable questions. But looking at Lucy, now lying on her back in the grass making pictures out of clouds, she realized running wasn't an option anymore. Then we'll have to prove him wrong, she said with more confidence than she felt. How? James turned to her with desperate eyes. You don't understand Boston society, Catherine. Charles has money, influence, a proper household with servants and tutors. What do we have? We have love, Catherine said simply. And Lucy is happy here. Will that be enough to convince a judge? The question hung between them like storm clouds gathering. Catherine had heard stories about wealthy relatives using the law to take children from parents they deemed unfit. Money talked louder than love in courtrooms. There might be another way, Catherine said slowly, an idea forming that both terrified and thrilled her. What do you mean? Marriage changes everything, doesn't it? A married man with a proper wife presents a very different picture than a single father with an unmarried housekeeper. James stared at her as if she had suggested they sprout wings and fly. Catherine, you can't be serious. I'm completely serious. The words tumbled out before she could stop them. It would solve everything. Lucy would have a mother in the eyes of the law, you'd have a respectable household, and I'd have… What? What would you have? Catherine looked at this man who had given her a chance when no one else would, at the child who had claimed her heart so completely. I'd have a family, she whispered. A real family. You don't understand what you're asking, James said roughly. Marriage isn't just a legal arrangement. It's… I know what marriage is, Catherine interrupted. I'm not asking you to love me, James. I'm asking you to let me help save Lucy. The use of his first name seemed to shock them both. They had been so careful to maintain proper distance, even as their lives became more intertwined each day. Miss Catherine. Papa. Lucy came running back, grass stains on her dress and flowers in her hair. I found the prettiest rocks by the creek. Want to see? She held out her palm, revealing 3 smooth stones that caught the light like jewels. Her face was bright with simple joy, completely unaware that her world might be about to crumble. They're beautiful little star, James said, his voice thick with emotion. I'm going to put them on Mama's grave, Lucy announced. She always liked pretty rocks. As Lucy skipped toward the house, chattering about her treasures, Catherine felt James's eyes on her. 1 week, he said quietly. Charles will be here in 1 week. Then we have 1 week to decide, Catherine replied. They walked back to the house in silence, both lost in thoughts too dangerous to speak aloud. The shooting lesson was forgotten, the tin cans still sitting on the fence like silent witnesses to the moment everything changed. That evening, as Catherine tucked Lucy into bed, the little girl grabbed her hand. Miss Catherine, you won't leave us, will you? Not even if Uncle Charles says you should. Catherine smoothed Lucy's hair, her heart breaking at the trust in those green eyes. What makes you think he would say that? I heard Papa talking to himself when he thought I was asleep. He sounded scared. Catherine sat on the edge of the bed, choosing her words carefully. Sometimes grown-ups have to make difficult decisions to protect the people they love. Do you love us? Lucy asked with the direct honesty of childhood. The question pierced Catherine like an arrow. Yes, she whispered. I love you both very much. Then you'll stay. People who love each other don't leave. If only it were that simple, Catherine thought as she kissed Lucy's forehead and blew out the lamp. If only love were enough to overcome law and money and social expectations. But as she walked past James's study and saw him hunched over his desk, probably trying to figure out legal ways to keep his daughter, Catherine realized that sometimes love had to be enough, because the alternative was unthinkable. The dress Catherine wore to church that Sunday was the finest thing she owned, deep blue cotton with tiny pearl buttons that had belonged to her mother. She had brushed her hair until it shined and pinned it up with extra care, knowing that today every eye in Clearwater would be judging her worthiness to stand beside James Caldwell and his daughter. You look beautiful, Miss Catherine, Lucy whispered as they walked up the church steps together. Like a real lady in a storybook. Catherine squeezed Lucy's small hand, drawing strength from the child's innocent confidence. Inside the church, conversations died as they made their way to the Caldwell family pew, and Catherine felt the weight of dozens of stares following their movement. Pastor Williams smiled warmly from the pulpit, but Catherine noticed how Mrs. Henderson's lips pursed with disapproval, how the banker's wife whispered something behind her fan to the woman beside her. Ignore them, James murmured, his hand gentle on her elbow as he guided her into the pew. They don't matter. But Catherine knew they did matter. These people would be the ones Charles Hartwell spoke to when he arrived, the ones whose opinions would shape his report about Lucy's living situation. The service passed in a blur of hymns and scripture, but Catherine found it hard to concentrate with so many eyes watching her every move. When Pastor Williams announced that there would be a church social after the service, her stomach clenched with dread. "We don't have to stay," James said quietly, reading her expression. "Yes, we do," Catherine replied. "Running away will only make things worse." The church social was held in the adjoining hall, with tables laden with food brought by the congregants. Catherine had contributed her famous apple cake, and she watched nervously as people sampled it and either nodded with approval or whispered among themselves. Catherine Riley, Mrs. Murphy, the shopkeeper's wife, appeared at her elbow with a warm smile. "This cake is absolutely divine. You must give me the recipe." "Of course," Catherine said gratefully, relieved to find at least one friendly face in the crowd. "Patrick tells me you've been such a blessing to the Caldwell family," Mrs. Murphy continued. "Little Lucy looks positively radiant these days." "She's a wonderful child," Catherine replied, glancing across the room where Lucy was playing with a group of children from the reading circle. "Indeed she is, and it's clear she adores you." Mrs. Murphy leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Don't mind the gossips, dear. Some people in this town have nothing better to do than pick apart other folks' happiness." Before Catherine could respond, Mrs. Henderson materialized beside them like a storm cloud. "Miss Riley," she said with false sweetness, "how interesting to see you here. I don't recall seeing you at services before." "I've been attending for several weeks," Catherine replied evenly, though her hands trembled slightly. Of course. And how are you finding life on the Caldwell ranch? It must be quite isolated for a young woman like yourself." The emphasis on young woman was unmistakable, and Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I find it very peaceful, thank you." "I'm sure you do." Mrs. Henderson's smile was sharp as a knife. "Though I do worry about propriety. A single man and an unmarried woman under the same roof. Well, it does cause talk." Mrs. Murphy bristled. "Martha Henderson, I'm surprised at you. Miss Riley is providing a valuable service to that family, and anyone with eyes can see how much good she's done." "Oh, I'm not criticizing," Mrs. Henderson said with mock innocence. "I'm simply concerned about appearances, especially with Lucy's uncle arriving soon." Catherine's blood turned to ice. "You know about Mr. Hartwell's visit? Word travels fast in a small town, dear. He sent a telegram to the pastor, asking about the family's circumstances." Mrs. Henderson's eyes glittered with malicious satisfaction. "I'm sure he'll be very interested to hear about the current arrangements." Before Catherine could respond, James appeared at her side, his face dark with anger. "Mrs. Henderson," he said coldly, "I believe your husband is looking for you." The banker's wife smiled sweetly but retreated, leaving Catherine feeling shaken and exposed. "What did she say to you?" James asked, his voice tight with concern. "Nothing I didn't expect," Catherine lied, not wanting to worry him further. But the damage was done. As they walked home from church, Catherine felt the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on her shoulders. Every whisper, every sideways glance, every barely concealed sneer added to her growing certainty that she was Lucy's biggest liability. "Papa," Lucy said as they unhitched the wagon. "Why was Mrs. Henderson being mean to Miss Catherine?" James knelt beside his daughter, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Sometimes people say unkind things when they don't understand a situation. But Miss Catherine is good," Lucy protested. "She takes care of us and teaches me things and makes you smile again." Catherine felt tears prick her eyes at the child's fierce defense. "I know she is, little star," James said softly, "and the people who matter know it too." That evening, after Lucy was asleep, Catherine found James on the porch, staring out at the mountains. The weight of unspoken decisions hung between them like morning mist. "We need to talk," Catherine said, settling into the chair beside him. "I know." James's voice was heavy with exhaustion. "Charles will be here in 4 days. Mrs. Henderson knows. She's probably already sent him a letter detailing every perceived impropriety." Catherine took a shaky breath. "James, My being here is going to cost you Lucy. Don't say that. It's true and you know it. An unmarried woman living in your house, helping raise your daughter. It's exactly the ammunition he needs. James was quiet for a long moment, watching the stars emerge one by one. There is another option, he said finally. Catherine's heart skipped. What do you mean? We could get married. Before Charles arrives. The words came out in a rush, as if he was afraid he'd lose his nerve. Pastor Williams could perform the ceremony. It would solve everything. The proposal hung between them, practical and terrifying in equal measure. James, Catherine said carefully, marriage should be about more than solving problems. Should be, yes, but sometimes life doesn't give us ideal choices. He turned to look at her, his eyes intense in the moonlight. I care about you, Catherine, more than I thought I could care about anyone again. And I know you love Lucy. I do love her, more than my own life. Then marry me, not for romance or grand passion, but for her. To keep her safe and happy and home where she belongs. Catherine felt her carefully constructed walls crumbling. This wasn't the proposal she had dreamed of as a young girl, but it was real and honest and born of genuine need. What if it doesn't work? She whispered. What if Charles still finds reasons to take her? Then at least we'll have tried everything. James reached for her hand, his fingers warm and calloused from years of ranch work. Catherine, I can't promise you love, but I can promise you partnership, respect, a real place in this family. Catherine looked down at their joined hands, thinking of all the ways this could go wrong. But then she thought of Lucy's trust, of morning pancakes and evening stories, of the feeling of belonging she had found in this house. Yes, she said quietly. Yes, I'll marry you. James let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for days. Are you sure? I'm terrified, Catherine admitted. But I'm sure. They sat together in comfortable silence, hands intertwined, watching the Montana sky sparkle with possibilities and promises. In 4 days, everything would change one way or another. But tonight they had hope. The sound of Lucy's delighted squeal echoed through the small church as Pastor Williams announced that Catherine would now be her new mama. 3 days had passed since James's proposal, and they had kept their decision secret from everyone except the kind pastor and the Murphys, who had helped arrange everything with lightning speed. Really and truly? Lucy asked, bouncing on her toes as she looked between James and Catherine with eyes as bright as Christmas morning. Really and truly? Catherine confirmed, kneeling down to straighten the wildflowers in Lucy's hair. The child had insisted on being the flower girl, even though there were only 5 people present for the ceremony. Mrs. Murphy dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief while her husband Patrick beamed with satisfaction. I knew from the moment I saw you 3 together that this was meant to be, the shopkeeper's wife declared. Catherine smoothed her simple ivory dress, the same one James's mother had worn 30 years ago, hastily altered to fit her smaller frame. It wasn't the wedding she had dreamed of as a young girl, but something about the quiet ceremony felt more honest than any grand affair could have been. Miss Catherine, Mama Catherine, Lucy giggled at the new title. Do I get to throw flower petals now? After we say our vows, James explained gently, though Catherine noticed his hands were trembling slightly as he helped Lucy arrange her basket. Pastor Williams opened his worn Bible, his weathered face kind as he looked at the unusual family before him. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today to join James Caldwell and Catherine Riley in holy matrimony. As the familiar words washed over them, Catherine found herself studying James's profile. His jaw was set with determination, but she caught glimpses of something softer when he looked at Lucy. This marriage might be born of necessity, but the love for his daughter was absolutely real. Do you, James Robert Caldwell, take Catherine Marie Riley to be your lawful wedded wife? James turned to face Catherine fully, his brown eyes serious as he spoke the words that would bind their fates together. I do. And do you, Catherine Marie Riley, take James Robert Caldwell to be your lawful wedded husband? Catherine's voice caught slightly as she answered. I do. The words felt heavier than she had expected, full of promises she wasn't sure either of them fully understood yet. The rings, Pastor Williams asked. James produced a simple gold band that had also belonged to his mother. As he slipped it onto Catherine's finger, his touch was gentle but impersonal, the gesture of a man fulfilling an obligation rather than expressing love. By the power vested in me by the territory of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Pastor Williams smiled warmly. James, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was brief and chaste, more like a handshake between business partners than the seal of romantic union. But Lucy clapped her hands with joy, and that was enough to make Catherine's heart lift despite her nerves. Now can I throw the flowers? Lucy asked impatiently. Now you can throw the flowers, James laughed, and Lucy scattered her wildflower petals with enthusiastic abandon, filling the small church with the scent of mountain blooms. After they signed the marriage certificate, making everything legal and official, Mrs. Murphy insisted on hosting a small reception at the general store. She had prepared a simple cake and coffee, transforming the ordinary shop into something festive with ribbons and more wildflowers. To the happy couple, Patrick Murphy toasted, raising his coffee cup high. May your marriage be blessed with joy and understanding. Catherine sipped her coffee and tried to feel like a proper bride, but the whole situation felt surreal. Just 3 days ago, she had been James's employee. Now she was his wife, Lucy's stepmother, and part of a family she had never dared to hope for. Mrs. Caldwell, Lucy said, testing out the new name with obvious delight. What do we do now that you're married to Papa? Well, Catherine said carefully, I suppose we go home and figure out how to be a family. Will you and Papa share a room now? Lucy asked with the innocent curiosity of childhood. Catherine and James exchanged awkward glances. They hadn't discussed the practical arrangements of their marriage, too focused on the legal benefits to consider the intimate details. We'll figure all that out later, little star, James said diplomatically. As the afternoon wore on, Catherine found herself watching James interact with the Murphys and Pastor Williams. He was respected in this community, seen as a good man who had endured terrible loss with dignity. By marrying her, he was offering her the protection of his reputation and social standing. But what was she offering him in return? Her cooking skills and ability to care for Lucy were valuable, but hardly equal to the gift of legitimacy and belonging he had just given her. You look troubled, Mrs. Murphy observed, joining Catherine by the store's window where she stood watching Lucy chase butterflies in the small garden behind the building. Just thinking about all the changes ahead, Catherine admitted. Marriage is always an adjustment, dear, even under the best circumstances. Mrs. Murphy patted Catherine's arm kindly. But I've watched you with that child and her father these past weeks. You care for them deeply. I do, Catherine said softly. More than I expected to. And they care for you. I see how James looks at you when he thinks no one is watching. That's not the look of a man making a purely practical arrangement. Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. Mrs. Murphy, we're both being realistic about what this marriage is. Sometimes the heart is wiser than the head, child. Give it time. As evening approached, they gathered their few belongings and prepared to return to the ranch as a legally married family. Lucy chattered excitedly about having a real mother again, while James and Catherine maintained polite but careful distance from each other. The wagon ride home was quiet except for Lucy's running commentary on everything she saw. She pointed out her favorite trees, described the personalities of various cattle they passed, and asked dozens of questions about what their life would be like now. Will we have more children? Lucy asked suddenly, causing both adults to nearly choke on their own breath. Lucy, James said firmly, that's not something you need to worry about right now. I just thought it might be nice to have a baby brother or sister, Lucy said innocently. Sarah Henderson has 3 little brothers, and she says they're lots of fun when they're not being pests. Catherine stared straight ahead at the road, her face burning with embarrassment. The practicalities of their arrangement suddenly seemed much more complicated than they had during their quick planning sessions. As they pulled up to the ranch house, Catherine felt a strange mix of homecoming and terror. This was her house now, her family, her life. The weight of responsibility and possibility pressed down on her shoulders like a heavy quilt. "Welcome home, Mrs. Caldwell," James said formally as he helped her down from the wagon. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," she replied with equal politeness. Lucy rolled her eyes at their formality. "You two are being silly. We're family now. Families don't have to be so polite all the time." As they walked toward the house together, husband, wife, and daughter, Catherine wondered if the child was right. Maybe formality was just another wall to hide behind, and maybe it was time to start tearing down walls instead of building them higher. The evening star was just appearing above the mountains, bright and steady in the darkening sky. Catherine made a silent wish on that star, hoping that somehow this marriage of convenience might grow into something real and lasting. Time would tell if wishes made on wedding nights had any power at all. Charles Hartwell stepped off the stagecoach like a man surveying property he intended to purchase, his expensive Boston suit and polished shoes making him look completely out of place in the dusty frontier town. His pale eyes swept across Clearwater with obvious disdain, taking in the rough wooden buildings and unpaved streets as if cataloging evidence of civilization's failure. "Uncle Charles!" Lucy's excited cry cut through the morning air as she spotted the tall, austere figure emerging from the coach. But Charles barely glanced at his niece, instead focusing his attention on James with the intensity of a judge preparing to deliver a verdict. His handshake was firm but cold, designed to establish dominance rather than express warmth. "James," he said in clipped tones that carried the authority of old money and older bloodlines, "I trust you received my telegram about bringing my wife, Constance. She found the journey quite taxing and is resting at what passes for a hotel in this establishment." The pause before establishment made it clear what Charles thought of frontier accommodations. Everything about his manner suggested a man who had already decided what he would find at the ranch and was simply going through the motions of investigation. "Lucy appears well enough," Charles continued, studying his niece with the detached interest of someone examining livestock, "though I notice certain irregularities in her appearance and behavior that we shall need to address." Catherine felt her protective instincts flare as Charles criticized Lucy's sun-touched skin and confident demeanor. The child was healthy and happy, exactly what any loving relative should want to see. "She's thriving here," James said carefully, his voice tight with the effort of remaining polite. "Thriving." Charles repeated the word as if it tasted bitter. An interesting choice of terminology for a child who clearly lacks proper refinement and social training. Lucy, oblivious to the undercurrents of tension, skipped closer to her uncle with innocent enthusiasm. "Uncle Charles, wanna see my arithmetic? I can count by sevens all the way to 100, and I know all my letters forwards and backwards." "Indeed." Charles's smile was thin and didn't reach his eyes. "And who has been providing this education?" "My wife has been working with her," James said, and Catherine felt her heart skip at hearing herself described that way for the first time. Charles's eyebrows shot up so high they nearly disappeared into his perfectly groomed hairline. "Your wife." The words came out sharp as broken glass. "James, surely you're not serious. Margaret has been gone barely 3 years. Time enough for a man to realize his daughter needs a mother's care," James replied evenly, though Catherine could see the muscle jumping in his jaw. "And where, pray tell, did you find this wife? I wasn't aware that suitable women were readily available in such remote locations." The insult hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Catherine stepped forward, extending her hand with all the grace she could muster. "I'm Catherine Caldwell, Mr. Hartwell. It's a pleasure to finally meet Lucy's uncle." Charles looked at her offered hand as if it might carry disease before giving it the briefest possible shake. His pale eyes catalogued every detail of her appearance, her simple dress, her calloused hands, her lack of jewelry beyond the plain wedding band. "Miss," he began, then corrected himself with obvious reluctance. "Mrs. Caldwell. How unexpected. And what, may I ask, qualified you to become mother to my sister's child?" The question was a trap, designed to expose whatever shortcomings he assumed she must possess. Catherine lifted her chin, drawing on every lesson in dignity her own mother had taught her. "Love qualified me, Mr. Hartwell. love for Lucy and determination to see her grow into the remarkable young woman she's destined to become. Love. Charles spoke the word like a foreign concept. How rustic. In Boston, we consider education, breeding, and social position rather more important than mere sentiment. Papa? Lucy whispered, suddenly sensing the tension crackling between the adults. Why is Uncle Charles talking like that? Your uncle is just tired from his long journey, little star, James said quickly. Why don't you show him your reading while we get the wagon ready? Lucy brightened, always eager to demonstrate her newly acquired skills. She ran to fetch the book Catherine had been reading with her, a collection of fairy tales that Margaret had owned as a child. This was Mama's book, Lucy announced proudly, settling beside Charles on the bench outside the general store. Mama Catherine, has been teaching me to read the hard words. Charles's face darkened at Lucy's casual use of Mama Catherine, but he listened with growing surprise as his niece read aloud with clear pronunciation and obvious comprehension. When she explained the meaning of difficult words and discussed the story's themes, his eyebrows climbed higher. Quite adequate, he admitted grudgingly. Though naturally, proper tutors in Boston could provide much more advanced instruction. But I like learning with Mama Catherine, Lucy protested. She makes it fun, and she answers all my questions about everything. I'm sure she does, Charles said dryly. Tell me, child, what else has this woman been teaching you? Lucy launched into an enthusiastic description of her lessons in cooking, arithmetic, geography, and even basic medical care. She demonstrated her knowledge of Montana's wildlife, explained the principles of farming and ranching, and recited poetry with clear diction. With each display of Lucy's education, Charles's frown deepened. He had clearly expected to find an ignorant, neglected child who would benefit from his rescue. Instead, he was confronting a bright, confident, well-educated little girl who obviously adored her current life. And what of your religious instruction? Charles asked, grasping for familiar ground. Pastor Williams says I'm one of the best students in Sunday school, Lucy replied promptly. And Mama Catherine reads Bible stories with me every night before bed. Catherine watched Charles struggle to find fault with Lucy's upbringing. Every criticism he had prepared was being systematically demolished by the evidence before his eyes. The child seems adequately cared for, he finally conceded, the admission clearly costing him effort. However, there are broader considerations beyond mere book learning. Such as? James asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Social position, cultural refinement, proper connections that will serve her well in marriage and society. Charles's pale eyes glittered with renewed confidence. A frontier ranch, however well-intentioned, cannot provide the advantages of Boston society. And what if Lucy doesn't want those advantages? Catherine asked boldly. What if she's happy here, with people who love her and a life that challenges her to grow? Charles turned his full attention to Catherine for the first time, studying her with the intensity of a scientist examining an interesting specimen. My dear woman, surely you cannot believe that happiness is more important than security and social standing? I believe happiness is the foundation of everything else worth having, Catherine replied firmly. How wonderfully naive. Charles's smile was sharp as a blade. Tell me, Mrs. Caldwell, what exactly is your background? Where did you receive your own education and social training? The questions felt like arrows aimed at her heart. Catherine knew that whatever she said would be twisted into evidence of her unworthiness to raise Margaret's daughter. I was educated by my father, who was a traveling physician, she said carefully. I've lived in several states and learned from many different teachers. A traveling physician. Charles's tone suggested this was exactly what he had expected to hear. How unconventional. And your family's social connections. My family believed in the connections we make through kindness and service to others, Catherine replied, refusing to be ashamed of her modest background. Charles nodded as if she had just confessed to multiple crimes. I see. James, surely you understand that Lucy deserves better than to be raised by someone with such limited social prospects. I understand that Lucy deserves to be raised by someone who loves her unconditionally. James shot back, his patience finally fraying. Someone who sees her potential rather than trying to squeeze her into society's narrow expectations. Uncle Charles, Lucy interrupted, tugging on his sleeve with innocent determination. You should come see our house. Mama Catherine made the prettiest curtains for my room, and she taught me how to braid friendship bracelets. I made one for you. She produced a carefully braided cord of colorful threads, offering it to Charles with a smile that could have melted stone. For just a moment, his stern facade cracked, and Catherine glimpsed the man who had once loved his sister enough to travel across the country to check on her child. But the moment passed quickly, and Charles's expression hardened again. Very thoughtful child. We shall discuss many things during my visit. As they loaded into the wagon for the ride to the ranch, Catherine felt the weight of Charles's disapproval pressing down on her like storm clouds. The battle for Lucy's future was just beginning, and she wasn't sure love would be enough to win against money, influence, and social expectations. But watching Lucy chatter happily between her father and new stepmother, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories, Catherine knew she would fight with everything she had to protect this family they had built together. The stakes had never been higher, and failure wasn't an option. The crash of breaking china shattered the morning peace as Lucy's teacup slipped from her trembling fingers, sending delicate porcelain fragments across the dining room floor like fallen stars. Charles Hartwell's wife, Constance, gasped in horror while Charles himself turned an alarming shade of purple. This is precisely what I mean, Charles thundered, rising from his chair with such force that it nearly toppled backward. A properly trained child would never display such clumsiness with valuable items. Lucy's face crumpled as she stared at the broken pieces, tears beginning to pool in her green eyes. Catherine immediately moved to comfort the child, but Charles held up a commanding hand. No, he said sharply. Let her learn from her mistake. In Boston, children understand the consequences of careless behavior. It was an accident, Catherine said firmly, kneeling beside Lucy to help gather the larger pieces. Anyone can have accidents. Accidents, Charles repeated with disdain, are what happen when children lack proper discipline and training. This is exactly the sort of behavior that concerns me. The past 3 days had been a carefully orchestrated campaign of criticism. Charles had arrived with predetermined notions about Lucy's deficiencies, and every meal, every lesson, every moment of normal childhood behavior was twisted into evidence supporting his case. Uncle Charles, Lucy whispered, her voice small as a bird's chirp, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to break your pretty cup. Sorry doesn't repair priceless family heirlooms, Charles replied coldly. This tea service belonged to your grandmother Hartwell. Each piece represents generations of careful preservation. Catherine bit back her angry response, knowing that losing her temper would only provide Charles with more ammunition. Instead, she helped Lucy clean up the mess while James watched from the doorway, his hands clenched into fists. Perhaps, Constance Hartwell suggested in her thin, reedy voice, this incident demonstrates why Lucy would benefit from proper instruction in deportment and social graces. In Boston, she would learn to handle fine things with appropriate care. She's 6 years old, James said through gritted teeth. Children her age are supposed to be learning, not performing like trained seals for adult approval. Charles's pale eyes glittered with triumph. And there we have the fundamental difference in our philosophies, James. You believe childhood should be about indulgence and freedom. I believe it should be about preparation for adult responsibilities. I believe childhood should be about being a child, Catherine interjected, unable to remain silent any longer. Lucy is bright, curious, and kind. Those are the qualities that matter most. Qualities that will serve her poorly in proper society, Charles countered. Tell me, Mrs. Caldwell, what do you know of piano instruction, French lessons, proper needlework, the social graces that distinguish a lady from a frontier woman? Each question was a barb designed to expose Catherine's inadequacies. She felt her cheeks burn with humiliation, knowing that her practical education meant nothing in Charles's world of artificial refinements. "I know how to teach a child to think for herself," Catherine replied steadily. "How to be kind to others, how to find joy in learning, how to grow into a confident young woman who doesn't need others' approval to know her own worth." "How very rustic," Charles said with a thin smile, "and utterly inadequate for a child of Lucy's breeding and potential." Lucy had been listening to this exchange with growing distress, her small face pale as she watched the adults argue about her future as if she weren't present. Finally, she could bear it no longer. "Stop!" she cried, her voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Stop fighting about me. I don't want to go to Boston, and I don't want to learn stupid piano lessons, and I don't care about being a proper lady." The outburst stunned everyone into silence. Lucy rarely raised her voice, and her defiance shocked even Catherine. "Lucy," Charles said sternly, "children do not interrupt adult conversations, and they certainly do not express such disrespectful opinions about their betters' decisions." "You're not my better," Lucy shot back with a courage that made Catherine's heart swell with pride and terror. "You're just mean, and you want to take me away from Papa and Mama Catherine and everything I love." "That is quite enough," Charles snapped. "James, this display of willfulness is exactly what I'm talking about. The child has been allowed to run wild, with no understanding of proper behavior or respect for authority. She has plenty of respect for people who deserve it," James replied coldly. "Maybe the problem isn't Lucy's behavior but your expectations." Charles's face darkened with anger. "My expectations are based on decades of experience with proper child rearing. Unlike some people, I understand the importance of discipline and structure. And I understand the importance of love and acceptance," Catherine fired back. "Lucy doesn't need to be molded into your idea of perfection. She's already perfect exactly as she is." "Perfect?" Charles laughed harshly. "A child who breaks valuable items, speaks rudely to her elders, and displays no knowledge of social graces is hardly perfect by any reasonable standard." "She's perfect because she's honest and brave and caring," Catherine insisted. "Because she asks questions and thinks for herself and treats everyone with kindness regardless of their social status. Virtues that will serve her poorly when she needs to make an advantageous marriage," Constance interjected primly. "In Boston society, a young woman's value is measured by her accomplishments and connections, not her rustic virtues." Lucy looked from one adult to another, her young mind struggling to understand why the grown-ups couldn't agree about what made her valuable. Catherine's heart ached for the confusion and hurt in the child's eyes. "What if I don't want to make an advantageous marriage?" Lucy asked quietly. "What if I want to marry someone who likes me for who I am, like Papa married Mama Catherine?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gunshot. Charles and Constance exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their opinion of James and Catherine's union. "Child," Charles said with exaggerated patience, "you cannot possibly understand such complex matters at your age. That is precisely why you need proper guidance from people who do understand the ways of the world." "I understand that Papa is happier now," Lucy said stubbornly. "And I understand that Mama Catherine loves us and takes care of us and makes everything better. I don't want to leave them for stupid Boston lessons." "Lucy," James said gently, kneeling beside his daughter, "why don't you go outside and check on the chickens? The grown-ups need to finish talking." Lucy looked like she wanted to argue, but something in her father's tone convinced her to obey. She cast one last defiant look at Charles before running from the room, leaving the adults to continue their battle without an audience. "Well," Charles said with satisfaction, "I think that little scene proves my point admirably. The child is willful, disrespectful, and completely unprepared for civilized society." "The child is honest about her feelings," Catherine countered, "something that seems to be discouraged in your version of civilized society." "Honesty without refinement is merely crudeness," Constance observed. "A proper young lady learns to express herself with grace and subtlety. A proper young lady learns to hide her true self behind artificial manners," Catherine shot back. "I'd rather Lucy be genuine than graceful." Charles stood abruptly, his decision clearly made. This conversation has confirmed my worst fears. James, I cannot in good conscience allow my sister's child to remain in an environment that values rebellion over respect, emotion over education, and sentiment over social advancement. You can't just take her, James said, his voice dangerous with barely controlled anger. Actually, Charles replied with cold satisfaction, I believe you'll find that I can. I've already spoken with the territorial judge about Lucy's situation. The combination of your hasty remarriage to a woman of questionable background and the child's obvious lack of proper training creates a compelling case for intervention. Catherine felt the world tilt beneath her feet. What do you mean, questionable background? Charles's smile was sharp as winter wind. Did you really think your history wouldn't follow you, Mrs. Caldwell? The daughter of a disgraced physician who lost his license for drinking? A woman who fled Denver under mysterious circumstances? Hardly the sort of person suitable to raise a Hartwell child. The blood drained from Catherine's face as her worst fears materialized. Somehow, Charles had discovered her secrets and was prepared to use them as weapons against Lucy's happiness. My past has nothing to do with how I care for Lucy, she said weakly. Everything about your past is relevant when it comes to my niece's welfare, Charles replied triumphantly. I have documentation, Mrs. Caldwell, evidence of your father's disgrace, witness statements about your sudden departure from Denver, questions about your moral character that any reasonable court would find troubling. James stepped protectively closer to Catherine, his face blazing with fury. You investigated my wife? You came here under false pretenses, pretending concern for Lucy while secretly gathering ammunition for your attack. I came here to assess my niece's situation, Charles corrected. What I discovered was even worse than I had feared. A hasty marriage to cover an inappropriate arrangement, a woman with a history of deception and questionable associations, and a child being raised without proper moral guidance. Get out, James said quietly, his voice carrying more menace than any shout. Get out of my house before I do something we'll both regret. Oh, I'll leave, Charles agreed pleasantly. But I'll be back, James, with legal papers and proper authority. Enjoy these last few days with Lucy, because they will be your last. As Charles and Constance gathered their things and prepared to return to town, Catherine felt everything she had fought for crumbling around her. The man who had seemed like an answer to prayer had become the instrument of her family's destruction. But looking through the window at Lucy playing with the chickens, her face bright with innocent joy, Catherine knew the fight wasn't over yet. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds seemed impossible. The letter arrived with the morning mail like a death sentence wrapped in official seals and legal language that made Catherine's hands shake as she read the devastating words. Judge Morrison would hear Charles Hartwell's petition for custody in 3 days, and the preliminary ruling suggested that Lucy's best interests would indeed be served by removal to Boston. Mama Catherine, why are you crying? Lucy asked, appearing in the kitchen doorway with dirt on her dress and wildflowers in her hair, looking every inch the uncivilized child Charles had described to the authorities. Catherine quickly folded the letter, not wanting Lucy to see the legal words that threatened to tear their family apart. I'm not crying, sweetheart. Just something in my eye. But Lucy was too perceptive to be fooled by adult deceptions. She climbed onto Catherine's lap with the trusting intimacy of a child who had never doubted her place in the world, studying Catherine's face with serious green eyes. Are you worried about Uncle Charles? Lucy asked quietly. He made Papa angry yesterday, and you've been sad ever since he came. Catherine's heart clenched at the child's innocent observation. How could she explain that sometimes the people who claimed to love you most were the ones most determined to destroy your happiness? Sometimes grown-ups disagree about what's best, Catherine said carefully, smoothing Lucy's tangled hair. Your uncle thinks you might be happier living in Boston with him and Aunt Constance. Lucy's face scrunched up with the same expression she wore when confronting difficult arithmetic problems. But I'm already happy here. Why would I want to be happy somewhere else? The simple logic of childhood cut straight through all the legal complications and social expectations that adults use to justify their decisions. Lucy was happy, Genuinely, completely, radiantly happy. And that should have been the only consideration that mattered. "I don't know, little star," Catherine whispered, holding Lucy close and breathing in the scent of sunshine and flowers that always seemed to cling to the child's hair. James appeared in the doorway, his face grim as he held a similar official-looking envelope. "Judge Morrison wants to interview Lucy privately," he announced, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "Tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock. Catherine felt cold fear settle in her stomach like a stone. What kind of interview? The kind where they ask a 6-year-old to choose between the only family she's known and the promise of pretty dresses and piano lessons. James crumpled the letter in his fist. The kind where they make a child feel guilty for loving the wrong people. Lucy looked between her parents with growing alarm. "What's an interview? Am I in trouble?" "No, sweetheart," Catherine said quickly. "A nice judge just wants to talk to you and ask some questions about your life here." "What kind of questions?" James knelt beside his daughter, his hands gentle on her small shoulders. "He'll probably ask if you're happy, what you like to do, whether you feel safe and loved." "That's easy," Lucy said with relief. "I'll tell him I'm very happy and I love you and Mama Catherine and our house and my chickens and everything here." If only it were that simple, Catherine thought. But she knew that judges were influenced by more than a child's stated preferences. Money talked louder than love in courtrooms, and Charles had both wealth and social connections on his side. "Lucy," Catherine said carefully, "the judge might also ask you about Uncle Charles and what he's told you about Boston." Lucy's face clouded with confusion. "Uncle Charles said Boston has big libraries and fancy schools and proper ladies who know how to pour tea without breaking cups. But I like our library here, and I like learning from you, and I don't care about pouring tea properly." "What if the judge says you have to go to Boston anyway?" James asked gently. "What would you say to that?" Lucy's lower lip trembled, and for the first time since Charles's arrival, Catherine saw real fear in the child's eyes. "I'd say, please don't make me leave my family. I'd say I promise to be good and learn whatever lessons you want. But please let me stay home." The words broke Catherine's heart. No child should have to beg to remain with the people who loved her, shouldn't have to promise to change herself to earn the right to stay in the only home she'd ever known. That evening, after Lucy was asleep, Catherine found James on the porch, staring out at the mountains with the same expression he'd worn after Margaret's death, like a man watching his world crumble and knowing he was powerless to stop it. "We could run," Catherine said quietly, settling into the chair beside him. "Take Lucy and disappear before the hearing. Go to California or Oregon, somewhere Charles couldn't find us." James turned to look at her with surprise. "You'd do that? Give up everything here and live as fugitives?" "I'd do anything to keep Lucy safe and happy," Catherine replied without hesitation. "She's my daughter now in every way that matters. I won't let Charles turn her into some artificial Boston lady who's ashamed of who she really is." "Running would only prove his point about our character," James said wearily. "And if we were caught, Lucy would definitely be taken away. At least this way we have a chance to fight." "What kind of chance?" "You heard what Charles said about his evidence, his witnesses, his connections. The judge will see a respected Boston businessman on one side and a hastily married rancher with a questionable wife on the other." James reached for her hand, his fingers warm and calloused from years of hard work. "Maybe, but he'll also see Lucy herself. And anyone who spends 5 minutes with that child will know she's not being harmed or neglected. Will they? Or will they see a little girl who breaks teacups and speaks her mind and doesn't know how to curtsy properly?" Catherine's voice cracked with despair. "Charles has already convinced them that happiness isn't enough. Then we'll have to convince them it's everything," James said firmly. "We'll show them what real love looks like, what a real family feels like, and we'll trust that truth is stronger than money." Catherine wanted to believe him, wanted to have faith that love would triumph over social expectations and legal maneuvering. But she had learned too early that the world wasn't fair, that good people didn't always win, that sometimes the very act of loving someone made you vulnerable to losing them. "James," she said quietly, "what if we lose? What if the judge decides Charles is right and Lucy would be better off in Boston? James was silent for a long moment, his thumb tracing circles on the back of her hand. Then we'll know we fought for her with everything we had. And maybe someday, when she's old enough to make her own choices, she'll come back to us. The thought of waiting years to see Lucy again, of watching her grow up from a distance while Charles molded her into his idea of a proper young lady, was almost unbearable. But Catherine realized that fighting for Lucy meant being willing to lose her if that's what the law decided was best. "I love her so much," Catherine whispered, tears finally spilling over. "I never expected to love anyone this much again." "I know," James said softly. "And she loves you too. Whatever happens tomorrow, she'll always know that she was loved completely and unconditionally by both of us." As they sat together under the vast Montana sky, holding hands and holding on to hope, Catherine tried to memorize this moment. The sound of night birds calling, the scent of prairie grass, the feeling of being part of a family worth fighting for. Tomorrow would bring the judge's questions and Charles's accusations and the terrible possibility of losing everything that mattered. But tonight, they were still together, still a family, still believing that love might be enough to overcome the odds stacked against them. In the distance, a coyote howled its lonely song to the moon, and Catherine wondered if this was what heartbreak sounded like when it echoed across empty spaces, calling for something that might never answer back. But Lucy was sleeping peacefully in her bed, surrounded by all the love two imperfect adults could give her. And for now, that had to be enough. The fight for their family's future would begin with tomorrow's sunrise.